The first thing Rael Souza noticed about the dead was that they never looked surprised. He had been cataloging that fact for 11 months now, ever since the Vethkai made landfall on Europa Station and the war stopped being a headline and became a smell. Burned polymer, cauterized meat, the particular sweetness of oxygen leaking from a hull breach, which was not sweet at all, but which the human brain, in its stubborn animal way, kept insisting tasted like copper and green apples. He had catalogued the dead on Europa, on Callisto, on the long retreat through the Kepler transit corridors, where men and women he had eaten breakfast with became scenery. And not one of them, not one, had died with their face arranged into anything resembling shock. They all looked like they had simply stopped. Like a hand that stopped waving mid-gesture. Rael was not dead. He kept having to remind himself of that. He lived in Bay 7C of the Mireille Depot, which was not a home but which contained the things that made a home. A cot with a gray blanket, a shelf with 3 books he hadn't opened in 4 months. A small burner he used to heat water he rarely drank. The depot was a transit hub, one of the last functioning civilian military exchange points on the inner belt, and it moved people the way a river moves silt, taking them in from somewhere worse and depositing them somewhere less defined. Rael had arrived from somewhere worse. He had not been deposited anywhere. He ate in the officer's mess at Euro 600, even though he was no longer an officer. He ate in the civilian annex at 1800, even though he no longer felt civilian. He had stopped knowing which language to speak. The body had its habits. The habits had outlasted the reason for them. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at the seam where the wall panel met the floor. A thin line of shadow that could have been a gap or just the way the light fell. When Coordinator Fennec knocked and let herself in without waiting for an answer. She was small and precise, the way instruments were precise. She had the kind of face that had decided at some early point to commit to a particular expression and had never deviated from it. Rael had known her for 6 weeks and had not yet determined what the expression was. "You missed the briefing," she said. "I'm aware, that's the third one. I'm aware of that too." Fennec looked at the seam he had been staring at, then at him, then at the 3 unread books. The Vethkai have pushed through Ganymede's second defense ring. At current rate of advance, we have between 40 and 60 days before they reach the inner transit routes. She paused. The word "we" in that sentence is doing a lot of work. Rael said nothing. She set a tablet on his blanket. He didn't look at it. She sat down in the chair across from him, the chair he never used, and folded her hands with the carefulness of a person choosing words. "There's a program," she said. "Xenoneurology. It's been running for 8 months under Dr. Hesta Thorne. What they've found is it's difficult to describe cleanly. Try. The Vethkai don't communicate the way we assumed. Their command structure isn't hierarchical in any way our models predicted. It's experiential. Trauma-based, if you want to be blunt about it. Their commanders carry the memory of every death in their unit as a kind of biological encoding. It accumulates in a specific cluster of neural tissue, what Thorne's team calls the grief node. And that encoding, Fennec said, makes them visible, not to normal human perception, but to a human nervous system that has been modified." Now Rael looked at the tablet. The image on its screen was a scan. He knew enough anatomy to recognize the outline of a human skull, and within it, the soft gray terrain of a brain. But threaded through the prefrontal lobe, branching like frost on glass, was something that was not human tissue. It was faintly luminescent even in the scan, the way certain deep-sea organisms were luminescent, and it grew toward the optic nerve the way a vine grows toward light. "Neural graft," he said. "Vethkai tissue, harvested from a commander-cast specimen, non-lethal extraction." She paused. The specimen cooperated. He looked up. That was unusual enough to warrant it. One Vethkai cooperated with its own vivisection voluntarily. We still don't know exactly why. Thorne believes it was, she searched for the word, ashamed, of what its own kind had done. There is evidence the Vethkai have internal dissidents, but that is a separate conversation. Rael set the tablet down with the careful deliberateness of a man declining an argument. What does the graph do? It allows the host to perceive the grief nodes of living Vethkai, not as data, as image, the way a dream is an image. Each commander's accumulated trauma manifests as something specific, something drawn from the commander's own history, something the human eye can see and the human brain can interpret, even if the vocabulary isn't quite there yet. Thorne describes it as seeing the thing inside the armor. Fennec paused again. Once you can see that, you can find the flaw in it. Every grief node has a point of maximum resonance, a frequency of stimulus that will collapse it entirely. Force the trauma to the surface and the commander cast individual effectively goes offline. Non-violent, non-lethal. They describe it afterward as waking from a very long sleep. Rail sat with that for a moment. Outside, the depot moved its tonnage of displaced people. You need someone to volunteer, he said. We need someone who has nothing left to lose and enough left to care. That's poetic, Thorne wrote it. I thought it was a bit much, but she insisted. Fennec looked at him with the expression he still couldn't name. You served under Admiral Koss for 4 years. You were at the Callisto collapse. You've seen more Vethkai commanders in combat conditions than anyone currently available who isn't dead or in a psychiatric hold. And I'm halfway to the psychiatric hold myself, is the subtext. The subtext, Fennec said calmly, is that you have been sitting in Bay 7C staring at the floor for 11 weeks, and you have not once asked me what comes next. The silence lasted long enough that the ventilation system cycled, and distant sound of the depot's sorting machinery filled the space where words weren't. When do we start? He said. Thorne was not what he expected, which meant she was exactly what she appeared to be. She was tall and slightly stooped in the way of people who had spent years looking into microscopes, and she had the ink-stained hands of someone who still took handwritten notes, which Rail found either reassuring or alarming, and hadn't decided which. Her lab occupied what had been a cargo processing unit on the depot's upper deck, repurposed with the improvised resourcefulness that defined everything humanity had built in the last 2 years. Equipment that was technically for one thing being used ingeniously for another. The graft takes 48 hours to vascularize, she said, without preamble, leading him through the lab while technicians moved around them like water around stones. During that time, you'll experience what I've been calling the interval, disorientation, possibly some auditory hallucination. One subject reported seeing colors that didn't correspond to any wavelength he could name. Another subject reported smelling something she described as the feeling of being 8 years old. The brain is trying to make sense of new input channels before it has the vocabulary for them. How many subjects have you run? Thorne picked up a specimen container, examined it, set it down. 3. Results? 1 is fully operational with the graft and currently embedded with the Ganymede intelligence team. 1 experienced adverse immune response, and the graft was removed after 6 days. She has some residual visual distortion in low light, but is otherwise functional. She paused at a workstation and pulled up the same luminescent scan Rail had seen on Fennec's tablet. The 3rd subject we lost. Rail said nothing. Not from the procedure, Thorne said. He could see them. He went out looking. He was alone and he found more than he could handle. She looked at the scan as if it might have changed since she last looked at it. He was the bravest person I have ever met. He was also the most stubborn, which in this case was not a virtue. Rail thought about the dead and their unsurprised faces. I understand. I don't think you do yet, Thorne said, not unkindly, but you will. The procedure itself was quieter than he expected. He had built it up into something operatic in his mind, the drill, the exposure, the alien tissue making its way into the meat of him. But what he experienced was mostly a kind of settled pressure, like being underwater without the cold, and then a darkness that wasn't sleep and wasn't unconsciousness, but was something in between, something that had no clean human name. He drifted in it for what Thorne later told him was 4 hours. In the interval, he saw Yale. Yale was his navigator, had been his navigator, had been specifically the person who had died last on the Callisto evac, standing in a corridor that Rail had already cleared, facing a direction Rail had already marked as safe, when the Vethkai flanking unit came through a wall rather than a door. Rail had turned at the sound and seen the corridor afterward. He had not looked at Yael's face to check for surprise. In the interval, Yael was not dead. She was standing with her back to him, wearing the orange and gray vest she wore when she was running navigation drills. Her hair still in the 3-braid configuration she had never explained the logic of. He called her name. She didn't turn. He reached for her shoulder, and she dissolved the way things dissolve in that place between waking and sleep. Not dramatically. Not with any particular grief-laden symbolism, just simply not there anymore. Like a number that doesn't exist in the arithmetic you're doing. He woke up with his hands at his sides and Thorne's face close to his, checking his pupils. Left one is reacting slower, she said. That's normal. Left optic nerve is where the graft is densest. She held up 2 fingers. How many? 2, he said. I saw my navigator. In the interval? Yes. Thorne wrote something on her pad. That's new. What did she do? Nothing. She was just there. Grief-adjacent stimulus, probably. The graft is sensitive to accumulated loss. It may be calibrating on yours. She paused, pen still moving. I'm sorry about your navigator. She was good at her job, Rael said, which was not everything he meant, and was the most he could currently manage. He noticed the first change at Eero 600 the following morning, in the officer's mess. He had gone out of habit, the old groove of his daily routine pulling him along without requiring his participation. He had taken a tray, chosen the eggs that were not quite eggs, and the coffee that was not quite coffee, and sat at a table near the window that looked out over the depot floor. And when a man sat down across from him, a logistics officer Rael knew by face but not by name, Rael saw something above the man's shoulders. It was not large. It was not in its way frightening. It was a small figure, barely larger than the man's head, made of what appeared to be folded paper. Origami, in the sense that something had been creased and pressed and shaped into the outline of a child. It moved very slightly the way candle flame moves when there's no wind. And it looked at Rael with eyes that were just two small dark points and said nothing. Rael looked away. He looked back. The figure was still there. You all right? The logistics officer said. Yes, Rael said. Long night. He finished his coffee. He went back to the lab. You're seeing them, Thorne said. She didn't seem surprised. She seemed, if anything, pleased in the measured way of someone whose hypothesis is being confirmed. Already. That's faster than the others. It was a human. A man in the mess. The graph doesn't only read Vethkai. In its current calibration, it reads grief nodes in any sufficiently complex nervous system. She said this the way she said everything, as clean information. But something in her eyes suggested she knew the weight of it. You'll need to learn to filter. Cover the left eye with your hand. The graft concentrates there. It reduces the input significantly. He tried it. With his left eye covered, the figure above the logistics officer's head dimmed and disappeared. Like a switch, he said. Yes, though with practice it becomes more nuanced than binary. He kept the left eye covered for most of that first week, his hand moving to his face so often that people began to assume he had a headache. He saw figures above the heads of the depot's staff, the passing soldiers, the contractors, mostly small, mostly sad. A woman who had lost someone carried a figure that was 3 figures wound together, indistinguishable from each other, rotating slowly like a mobile above a child's bed. A mechanic who smiled at everyone carried something that sat perfectly still in the shape of a closed fist. A young communications officer carried nothing visible at all, which Thorne said meant either very little grief or grief so thoroughly suppressed that not even the graft could locate its edges. None of these were the enemy. None of these were what he had agreed to. On the 9th day, Thorne brought him to the holding cells. The Vethkai commander was called Designation 12 by the facility staff, because none of them could produce the Vethkai phoneme structure, and because the commander had not offered an alternative. It occupied a cell that had been modified to accommodate its biology. The atmosphere thickened slightly. The temperature 3 degrees cooler than comfortable for humans. The lighting shifted toward wavelengths in the blue-gray range. It sat, or the closest Vethkai approximation to sitting, which involved folding the lower 2 limbs under the body and extending the upper ones outward like a resting wingspan, in the center of the cell and did not turn when they entered. Rael had seen Vethkai in combat, which was to say he had seen them through smoke and emergency lighting, at a distance that was always either too close or not close enough. He had not, until now, been in a room with one when neither of them was trying to kill the other. The size was the first thing. They were taller than human, broader through the thorax. Their skin, if it was skin, Thorne had opinions about the terminology, a deep blue-gray that shifted slightly as the light found different angles. Their faces were not arranged for human expression, but they had, Rael had always privately thought, a quality of severity that felt like emotion even when it probably wasn't. He uncovered his left eye. Above the commander's shoulders, massive and slow-moving and complex, was a structure, unlike anything he had seen above a human head. It was a city. That was the only word he had for it. A city in collapse, towers folding into themselves in slow motion, bridges bending, walls crumbling toward a center that was already rubble. But the rubble moved. It rearranged. The towers tried to rebuild themselves from their own debris and almost, managed it, and then the collapse resumed. And in the streets of this collapsing city there were figures, small ones, dozens, moving with the stunted repetitive motion of something that has been given only a few instructions and plays them over and over. Some were falling. Some were running in loops between the same 2 points. Some were building with the pieces of the fallen towers. fitting them together in configurations that were never quite stable. And some of them were looking at Rael. He covered his eye. His hands were not shaking, but they wanted to. "What did you see?" Thorn said quietly. "A city," he said, "being destroyed. Over and over." He paused. "It's their dead, isn't it? Their commanders carry their units dead, as architecture, as something they have to keep building and watch fall down." Thorn was writing. "Yes, we believe so. The Vethkai don't grieve the way we do. Grief is not a private process for them, it's structural. It becomes part of how they think. It influences tactical decisions, communication patterns. The more dead a commander has accumulated, the more complex the grief node, and the more it dominates their cognition." She stopped writing. "The commander in this cell has lost more units than any specimen we've encountered. Whatever the Vethkai equivalent of trauma is, this individual is saturated with it." Rael looked at the cell wall. "And the procedure, finding the resonance point, would not erase the dead. We're very clear about that. It would decompress the structure. Give the accumulated grief a form the commander's nervous system could process without it overwhelming tactical function. The Vethkai have no mechanism for doing this themselves. Their biology doesn't provide for it." She paused. "Which we think is why the war started." He looked at her. "They grieve in a way that takes over," she said. "And eventually there's more grief than there is anything else. And then the only thing that reduces it temporarily is forward momentum, action, advance." She was quiet for a moment. "They're not fighting because they hate us. They're fighting because it's the only thing that makes the city in their heads go quiet for a little while." The weight of that settled in the air of the holding room. "That doesn't make them less dangerous," Rael said. "No," Thorn agreed. "It makes them more comprehensible, which is its own kind of terrible." He spent the next 3 weeks learning. Thorn worked with him every day, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch, developing what she called the vocabulary of the graft. Every grief node had its own architecture, and every architecture had a specific stimulus, a sound, a frequency of vibration, a particular quality of light or pressure that corresponded to the grief node's point of origin. Find the origin, apply the stimulus, and the accumulated structure began to decompress. The commander didn't lose their dead. They simply became able to carry them without being carried by them. The work was exact and exhausting, and sometimes, in the middle of it, Rael would catch a fragment of someone else's grief embedded in his own perception. A borrowed flash of something that had happened in a place he had never been, to something he had never been. A child falling in a city he had never seen, and he would have to stand very still until it passed. This was the cost Thorn had mentioned only briefly before the procedure. The graft was not cleanly directional. It took in and sometimes it gave back. He developed the habit of humming when this happened. An old song his grandmother had sung in a language he didn't fully speak anymore. Something about a river and a season and a door left open. The tune was simple enough that holding it required just enough of his attention to anchor him, and by the time he got to the end of it, which was also its beginning, a round that looped, the borrowed grief had usually faded to something manageable. Yale appeared in the interval again, 3 more times, always with her back to him. He stopped trying to get her to turn around. He stood near her in the place between sleep and waking and let himself be near her, which was not the same as having her back but was not nothing either. On a Tuesday in the 6th week, Thorn sat him down. "Intel has confirmed a Vethkai command unit operating in the Kepler buffer zone. 5 commander-cast individuals coordinating the Ganymede advance. If those 5 are removed from tactical function, even temporarily, we estimate a 3 to 5 week deceleration in the advance. Long enough for the Ganymede defense ring to complete its second retrofit." She put a map on the table between them. It was very clean, very precise, the kind of map that did not show the things that maps did not show. "We're sending a 5-person team. 4 tactical operators. 1 specialist." He looked at the map for a while. "The range on the graft," he said. "You need to be within approximately 20 meters to read clearly. Closer is better. 10 meters is ideal. That's inside their combat perimeter. Yes. The tactical operators are there too. Keep you alive long enough to do the work." Thorn folded her hands on the table. "Rael, I want to be honest with you. The commander-cast individuals in the buffer zone each carry grief nodes of a scale we haven't fully mapped. The city you saw in the holding cell, the specimen there has accumulated 62 unit deaths. The commanders in the buffer zone have accumulated, between them, more than 400. She let that number sit. What you'll see when you look at them will not be easy, and it will come back with you. Some of it will stay." He thought about what it might feel like to carry 400 deaths in the structure of his mind. He thought about whether there was a meaningful difference between that and what he already carried. "Tell me about the resonance points," he said. "All 5. The Kepler buffer zone was silence made physical. This was something combat veterans knew, and civilians couldn't quite picture. The silence that preceded contact was not the absence of sound, but a specific quality of presence. Something the air did that the body registered before the ears did. Rael had known this silence is military life and had learned to respect it the way you respected weather. He moved with the tactical team through what had been a relay station, now structurally compromised, corridors half open to space where the bulkheads had been struck and not repaired. The emergency seals held, barely, and the atmosphere was breathable in a technical sense, which was the only sense that mattered. Cassian, the team lead, moved like someone who had been doing this for so long that it had become a different category of consciousness. She communicated in hand signals that were fast and exact. Rael followed them as best he could, understanding the shape of them, if not always the specific vocabulary. "Contact in 90 seconds, Cassian said into the comm, so quietly she seemed to be talking to herself. "Rael, when I say go, you go left. 20 meters. What you need, you do it fast." "Yes," he said. "How long?" 40 seconds per individual, maybe less. "You have 30. He said nothing. There was no point in negotiating with reality. He heard them before he saw them. Not sound exactly, but the graft's awareness of them. A shift in perception the way a pressure changes before a storm. He covered his left eye with his hand, felt the input narrow to something manageable and prepared. Cassian said, "Go." He went left. The first commander was at the far end of the corridor, twice his height, its upper limbs extended in the combat posture that meant it was assessing. Rael uncovered his eye. The grief node above the commander was a forest of frozen light. Trees of glass, he thought, though they were not quite trees and not quite glass. But the image was the closest his vocabulary would come. Thousands of them, and in each one something preserved, a moment, a face, a gesture. Some intact and some shattered, and the shattered ones raining their fragments perpetually through the frozen light. The forest was enormous. It was almost beautiful. It was the most comprehensively sorrowful thing he had ever perceived. He found the resonance point in 11 seconds. It was a tone, not a sound the corridor could generate, but one the graft could. The graft, Thorne had explained, did not only receive. In its fully calibrated state, it could emit a targeted stimulus through the optic nerve's reverse pathway. A signal that the Vethkai nervous system would receive as originating from inside itself. The commander's grief node would hear the tone as its own thought. He held the tone. The forest trembled. The frozen trees shook, and the preserved fragments in them shifted, and for a moment, one long, complicated moment, the fragments rearranged themselves into something that was not preservation, and not collapse but something like rest. The commander's posture changed. The combat extension of its upper limbs lowered. It made a sound Rael had never heard from a Vethkai in combat, something low and sustained and entirely without aggression, and then it sat down, the folded limb posture of stillness, not surrender, and was still. 20 seconds. But the borrowed grief hit him immediately, a wave of someone else's loss breaking across him without warning. A sky full of stars going out one by one, each extinction a name he almost had and couldn't quite reach. He hummed his grandmother's song 2 bars and kept moving. The second commander was in what had been the station's operations bay. Its grief node was different. Not a city, not a forest, but a sound made visible. A scream held in suspension. Every frequency of it a different shade of unbearable, the whole structure of it vibrating at the edge of collapse that never completed. He found the resonance point in 19 seconds. When the scream structure decomposed, not disappeared, never disappeared, only ceased to dominate. The commander went still with a completeness that looked, from the outside, like exhaustion. He didn't have time to look at it as a person. He kept moving. Third, fourth. He was taking the borrowed grief with him, accumulating it, and the song was not enough anymore. So he let the grief be there. Let it run alongside him like a current he wasn't swimming in, but whose pull he could feel, and kept his attention on the work. This was something the body could do if you let it. Not immunity, just triage. The fifth commander was waiting for him. He understood this the way you understood certain things in combat. Not through evidence, but through the body's older intelligence. The commander had positioned itself at the station's primary junction, and when Rael turned the corner it was already oriented toward him, and its grief node. He almost stopped. The grief node was him, not literally, not with his face, But the structure of it, the architecture of accumulated loss, was arranged in a configuration his human brain read as familiar, the way a melody is familiar before you know its name. The commander had been watching the humans advance and retreat and die and hold and die again for however long. And what it carried was not a city or a forest or a frozen scream, but something that looked like a conversation that had never been finished. Two structures reaching toward each other, and the space between them, and in the space between them all the words that had not been said time. He thought about Yael, with her back to him. He covered his left eye and breathed. Cassian's voice in his calm, rail 30 seconds. He thought about what Thorn had told him. Not that they hate us. That the only thing that makes the noise in their heads go quiet is forward momentum. He thought about what it would mean to carry 400 losses in the fabric of your thought and have no mechanism, none, biological or cultural or otherwise, for putting them down. He uncovered his eye. He found the resonance point. It was not a tone. It was a texture. The feeling of having been witnessed, Thorn had called this one, the feeling of one grief-carrying being fully perceived by another. The graft could simulate this too, could transmit the experience of being completely seen, not judged, not fixed, just acknowledged. He held it as long as he could. The structure between the two reaching forms in the commander's grief node shifted. The space between them filled briefly with something that was not resolution, but was proximate to it, and the fifth commander, who had been waiting for him, lowered its upper limbs and made the low sound he'd heard from the first, and sat down in the corridor on the folded limb posture of stillness, and did not move. Cassian was at his shoulder. "Done," he said. "Can you walk?" He checked. The borrowed grief was considerable. A weight that sat behind his eyes and in the just under his sternum. Someone else's losses in his borrowed architecture. But the legs worked. "Yes," he said. They walked. He spent 4 days in the medical unit. Thorn visited twice a day and wrote things on her pad with the ink-stained hands, and asked him questions he answered, with varying degrees of accuracy depending on how tired he was. The borrowed grief filtered through him slowly, the way toxins filter, not painlessly, not quickly, but with the particular reliability of things that the body knows, eventually, how to process. "You took in a significant load," she said on the 3rd day. "More than the others, more than I expected you to carry and still function." "I had a good anchor," he said. She raised an eyebrow, which on her face was a significant expression. "A tunes," he said. "Old one, from my grandmother." He paused. "And something else. The 5th one." He thought about how to say it. The thing it was carrying, it wasn't only loss, there was something in the structure that was reaching. Not toward its own dead. Toward something it hadn't encountered yet. He stopped. "I think it recognized what I was doing. I think it let me in." Thorn was quiet for a moment. "The volunteering specimen," she said. "The one who cooperated with the graft procedure. When we asked it why, it said, as best we can translate, that it had been looking for someone who could see the weight of what it carried and not turn away." The ventilation hummed. The depot moved its people. Outside the medical unit's small window, the belt hung in the dark like every question ever asked about whether anything was worth it. Rail said, "And the Ganymede advance. 4-day deceleration has already been confirmed. The second retrofit is 80% complete." Thorn paused. "The 5 commanders you helped are cooperating with our negotiators. We don't have a common language yet, but we have a common, well, they're sitting at the same table. That's new." He thought about cities that tried to rebuild themselves from their own rubble and almost managed it. He thought about the kind of stubbornness that required. "The graft," he said. "Do we have more volunteers?" Thorn looked at him with the expression Fennec had, and that he still couldn't name, and which he was beginning to think was not an expression for any one thing, but was what a face did when it was trying to hold multiple true things at once. "We have a list," she said. "I'll brief them," he said. "Not just the procedure, the song too. Everyone needs something to hold on to when the borrowed grief comes." Thorn wrote on her pad. He watched her hands, the ink-stained knuckles, the particular carefulness with which she shaped letters, as though the words were worth the effort of precision. "What was the song?" she said. He told her. She wrote it down. And outside the belt turned in the dark, and the depot moved its people, and the war, which had not ended and would not end quickly, but which had for the first time in 11 months changed its nature, continued, differently. He did not see Yael in the interval that night. He thought he understood why. He lay in Bay 7C with the gray blanket, and the 3 unread books, and the small burner, and he looked at the seam where the wall panel met the floor, and this time he could see that it was not a gap. It was just the way the light fell, which was not everything he wanted it to mean, but was something, was a beginning, was the place from which, if you were stubborn enough, you could build.